In Chapter 8 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith gives an analysis of wages, the first and most basic part of a component's price. He starts by imagining a world where no one acquired enough goods to need to hire workers, and land and property had not been taken into private hands. As the division of labour got more specialised and production increased, all goods would have become cheaper. But, although things have become cheaper, they would actually appear more expensive. He gives a hypothetical example where for most items, productivity has increased by 10 times, but for one particular task, productivity has only doubled. Let's say for loaves of bread, productivity was now 10 times what it used to be, while making a chair was now only twice as easy. The cost of a chair would now be 5 times as much in loaves of bread as it used to be, but this apparent increase in cost is an illusion, because chairs would actually be half as expensive as they used to be, since they now required half the labour to purchase. Now that the labourer no longer gets the whole produce of his labour, the landlords and bosses have an advantage. Labourers have to work to sustain themselves. In any negotiations between a labourer and his boss, the labourer cannot hold out for a higher wage for as long as the boss can hold out for a lower wage. The labourer must work to survive. At the time Smith was writing, workers couldn't organise into unions to fight for higher wages, but bosses were allowed to come together to fight for lower wages. In most modern countries today, workers can unionise, but in America it remains very difficult for workers to come together, to form unions and to use their collective power to bargain for higher wages. There is, though, a certain rate below which it seems impossible to reduce the ordinary wages of even the lowest labour. This would be called today a subsistence wage, and it's the amount needed to supply workers and their family with the basic essentials of life. Wages cannot get lower than the least needed for the workers to stay alive, or the workers would either have to leave or die. Smith then looks at factors which leads to employers having to pay workers more than a subsistence wage. Wages rise when a nation is experiencing rapid economic growth. When an economy grows quickly enough, the demand for workers will outpace the supply available, and the employers must compete against each other. He gives as an example of this the then British colonies in North America, where wages were much higher than in England, despite England being a much richer nation. He lists the wages in New York for common labourers, ship's carpenters, house carpenters, bricklayers and tailors, all well above the average in London, and points out that since the cost of food and products there is so low compared to England, the difference in real terms is greater still. Although North America at that time was not yet as rich as Britain, it was thriving and growing more rapidly. The population in Britain at the time was expected to take 500 years to double, but in the American colonies it was doubling every 20 to 25 years. And even with such growth in population, the demand for labourers was growing faster than the population could keep up. For this reason, while having many children was a burden to poor families in Britain, it was a source of future wealth in the colonies, and a young widow with 4 or 5 young children who would be unable to find a second husband in Europe would have men frequently trying to marry her. He compares a country with a rapidly growing economy to one where the economy has seen no growth for centuries, China. China at that time was one of the wealthiest countries in the world, one of the most fertile and best cultivated countries, and one of the most industrious. It had, even then, the world's largest population. But it did not seem to have grown its economy since Marco Polo had visited hundreds of years earlier. Labourers at the time struggled to earn enough to raise a family and had to run about in the street as though begging for food. People were so poor that, in Smith's words, any carrion, the carcass of a dead dog or cat, though half putrid and stinking, is as welcome to them as the most wholesome food to people in other countries. And families, Smith claimed, had to kill their own children when they could not afford to raise them. For Smith, higher wages benefited all society. If no workers could afford to have children, where would the next generation of workers come from?